Welcome to the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast, where leaders gain the intelligence to be ready for today and prepared for tomorrow. In this episode, we sit down with Swaroop Tulsidas. Swaroop is formerly of the CSIRO and was heavily involved in the creation of Nature IQ. We will explore the digital background of sovereign supply chains and more. From AI and IoT to digital twins and cloud platforms, Southeast Asia and Oceania are reshaping how nations secure food, defence and critical resources. But in a world that's deeply interconnected, can technology ever truly be sovereign? Stay with us as we unpack the future of resilience, innovation and regional collaboration. Let's get into it. Swaroop, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Well, mate, the pleasure's all ours. I'm the fortune of meeting you just recently, and I was really enamored by your background, your history, and what you've been working on, and what you're about to start working on, as we just recently discussed as well. But your most recent role is really intriguing as well. You led the Nature IQ team at CSIRO, and that was melding tech and natural capital across Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Could you briefly share what what drew you into that intersection of environment and digital innovation?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I realized recently, after having a chat with one of the investors in Nature IQ that wanted to invest in Nature IQ, was effectively the thread that I've had through my career so far. And I came to the realization, I had this epiphany, I was like, oh, I'm actually really drawn to innovation. It's like I never sort of purposely seeked it, but it's sort of everything I was doing, and I was sold as these jobs that I was applying for were effectively focused on doing innovation and bridging things into what exists, the state of the current world, and what is possible. And this thing with the CSIRO effectively was extremely interesting because one, I had no idea about it. That ability to learn and force rapid learning is something that I really crave in any role that I'm in. And then the other things is, well, am I going to be able to add value into this? And bringing the entrepreneurial skills and the technology skills into the equation inside CSIRO is very appealing. And then also finally the impact, like the work that you're doing is effectively going to have significant impact, and you want to be able to do something that's going to be meaningful for just more than yourself. So these were the main things that drew me in, and there's a few others that are quite important as well. Two more basically. One, working with scientists at the CSIRO that are not just leading their field in Australia, but globally. That's a gift. I mean, you're working with people that are extremely smart, extremely humble, and that will bring depth to your thinking as you learn. And that was something that was very appealing. And then finally, the ability to be able to be autonomous and conceptualize strategy and execute it. Doing that as well was kind of the critical part for me.
Yeah, that it sounds like uh, a job made in heaven, really, doesn't it? You're coming in without having certain expectations, I guess, and then being able to build a platform as such to help really empower these smart minds. But can you just tell us a little bit about Nature IQ, what it is and what it did or what it does?
Yeah, so Nature IQ was built out of 20 years of research in the CSIRO, or more than 20 years of research in the CSIRO in the environmental space, and to capitalize on that research, scientists were getting questions around, what are the environmental impacts of doing X, Y, Z, for a mine extension, or what will be the environmental impacts into, like, you know, if we're constructing new buildings in a specific area and you're doing a master plan, what if we do that for renewable energy projects and so on and so forth? And the idea was, CSIRO scientists had the science. They had code that they had written to be able to, to get an understanding of what the biodiversity impacts were going to be, the impacts on the emissions of greenhouse gas, and consumption of water and so on and so forth. But they didn't have one way to unify everything. And so the first step we did was we take one science, which was biodiversity science, and effectively turn the science into a product. so that anyone without, environmental science degree can use. And then the sectors that we were focusing on with Nature IQ were effectively, the renewable energy sector, the mineral and resources sector, the finance sector, which powers the rest of the economy, the forestry sector, and then the built environment, basically.
Wow, that's really powerful, and I guess for an organisation like CSIRO and the people within that ecosystem, that's a real digital transformation for them, for the users and everyone in that value chain. Um,
Yeah, yeah, quite significantly because, you go from doing some lines of code, doing research and putting a report together to getting sort of real-time information with different simulations that you'll do. So it definitely changes the game quite a lot.
wow, and so I guess, yeah, Swaroop, with the Indo-Pacific, it's rapidly evolving, into intelligent, resilient supply chain ecosystems, and which is powered by AI and the Internet of Things and cloud and digital twins. With your experience of what you've recently seen and also broader than that, with your experience, overall, what sort of regional shifts are you seeing that excite or surprise you?
Well, when you mention resilient and intelligent supply chains, I think one of the critical parts are we talk about resilient and what does it mean to be resilient? And this is an interesting thing. You're resilient to different types of risks. Now, your listeners are probably familiar with, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, which comes out every year, and that report effectively categorizes risks anywhere in the world according to 5 categories: economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and then technological. And then they do a short-term risk horizon and then the long-term risk horizon. In the short term, the risk are likely mixed. You got a bit of technological risk from misinformation, cyber insecurity, polarization of society, and so on and so forth. But you also have some environmental risks. But when you look at the long term, out of the 10 global risks, 5 of them are environmental, extreme weather events, critical change to the earth systems, biodiversity collapse, natural resource shortages, and pollution. And when we talk about resilient supply chains, well, we need to be able to have an understanding of what we're fighting against. And the natural capital component effectively means, well, how are you going to be resilient to producing food when you know you're going to have extreme weather events? How are you going to be resilient to keeping your industry up to date with new equipment and so on and so forth when you're going to have mineral or any other resource shortages? And these are extremely important for any sort of country or organization to grapple with. The things that I'm sort of looking at in that space, and I want to highlight a little bit more some Australian startups doing incredible work on that area, but mainly focused on the actual sovereign component. How do we do this better? How do we do this quicker? So the first one is in the AI space because everyone's talking about AI. You've probably heard of Main Code. Main Code is building Matilda, the first sovereign large language model in Australia, trained on Australian sovereign content in an ethical way because content providers are effectively being remunerated for their content. So it's a game changer. And if we look at it from a technological perspective, we're usually tributary. You know,
Mm.
we don't have an Australian operator, and that's fine. Being a tributary in some cases is okay, but we don't have an Australian operating system, and to have one probably might not be the right thing to do. But we don't have that. We don't have a large language model until Matilda came together, and we need to be able to understand that if things in the world geopolitically change, how are we going to be able to respond? And everything is driven by computer today, and tomorrow a lot of it will be driven by artificial intelligence. And if we're not ready, well, then,
Yeah,
we're at risk.
yeah. Well, it sort of highlights the fragility of our supply chains, doesn't it?
Yeah, and so that's in the AI space, right? So that's a critical one. Then you have another one in the digital twin space, and this one is a bit closer to home. It's a Canberra startup that spun out of the CSIRO quite recently. They're called Terrier, and they effectively allow organizations and governments to be able to design infrastructure faster, cheaper, and with much better outcomes. Because what they do is they have a list of data sets around the country and soon globally that effectively allows engineering organizations and governments to be able to mash, okay, let's look at climate risk here. Let's look at the number of people using the specific infrastructure. Let's look at like population density, and putting all this information together and combining those information into like what the actual infrastructure build would look like is extremely critical. So Anna and her team are doing incredible work in that space. And that's, again, it's like a sovereign capability. And then in the other space you mentioned, in the IoT, I'm not sure. Have you heard of Ambient?
I haven't heard of them, no.
Yeah, so they're colleagues that were in the CSIRO that went on their own to do something else, and effectively they've built a solution to be able to program firmwares for Internet of Things. And so what it means is, like, any device that is a sensor that is working on extremely low power um, uh, energy and networks, it effectively allows them to be able to program those devices to be able to capture data and get an outcome. So one of the examples of the products that they're launching effectively is a smart collar for cattle, to be able to get GPS tracking for the cattle and other informations around animal welfare and so on and so forth. So, and again, agriculture, quite critical aspect of our supply chains, not just in Australia but globally, because we export quite a lot. And so it's very important that we have those technological advances being done in Australia by Australian companies.
Yeah, that's really exciting, and especially with those features and benefits that you mentioned with some of those products. Also thinking about our neighbours in the Indo-Pacific as well, who aren't, as advanced as we are, don't have the same power networks, don't have the same access to internet. Obviously in those developing nations, they could greatly benefit those particular countries and the people of those countries.
Oh, totally. And I mean, other than, Main Code and Matilda, which is definitely an Australian centric thing, I mean, the other two startups are focusing obviously on Australia, but also on, getting to the rest of the world very shortly. So, and really smart people, really capable people. So I'm really excited to see what they're going to do next.
Oh, that's great. Well, Curtis West, who's my partner in Vaxa, he and his team are currently building something very exciting around open source and human intel, utilizing AI, the IoT, and digital twins, which is really exciting. But I can't talk too much about it at the moment.
No worries. Keep it on the wraps until you release.
That's right. That's right. Mate, the region, the Indo-Pacific, it's poised to scale e-commerce, digital finance, and super apps, and some of those you've just spoken about. It's also pushing for, digital sovereignty. How do you see the public-private collaboration shaping that trajectory?
Yeah, so in the space of, e-commerce and super apps, there obviously is some work for the government to do when it comes to most of what they do, which is regulating. And some people might like it, some people might not like it. But effectively, when we talk about super apps, um, we're talking about a solution that combines significant amounts of data on you as a user, as a consumer, because the whole model is based around moments, marketing moments. So, you're going to buy a house, you're going to need to access finance. You're going to see mates, or you're going to watch a game with your mates. You need to get an Uber. You're going to order food, and all these different elements. You're doing, any other type of commerce activities, buying whatever you need to, or getting tickets to an event. So the apps effectively combine significant amounts of data, and so there is a requirement for the government to be able to provide an understanding of, okay, what's permissible and what's not permissible, and how will that benefit the consumer in the end. Giving data is a trade-off. You're giving your data away, but what you're giving your data for, and most of the time it's convenience. And when we talk about these super apps, we have this model that was pioneered by Tencent and WeChat, and Alibaba and Alipay. And this model has taken a significant growth in the last couple of years in Southeast Asia. Gojek in Indonesia is one of the other super apps that is used by a significant amount of users. And then Grab, again, present in a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia as well. So these super apps effectively provide significant benefit, but the role in the public-private sector space, in the public-private partnership space, is probably limited to being able to provide the playing field, and then making sure, as a government, that you're not uh, having significant risk as a result of that, because you're also here to make sure that the economy will be able to thrive, and small business is a key part of that. And there's an example in the last couple of years around TikTok and the Indonesian government ban. Were you a little bit familiar with what happened there? So the government effectively, and just to for the people listening, that the government effectively saw a significant threat in TikTok's social commerce developing, and I think in 2023 it was like, in the whole of Southeast Asia, it was like 4 billion, and it quadrupled to 16 billion in 2024. I mean, the date might be a bit off, but that's the size of the beast. And so the Indonesian government saw that might be eroding small business, and it might be starting to go even further into market concentration. And so they banned that ByteDance as the application there for commerce. So TikTok was still able to run, but you can buy things there through the app. What what they did is they decided to acquire Tokopedia for $750 million, which was the largest player at the time in e-commerce in Indonesia. And then they circumnavigated that sort of problem effectively, if you look at it, by injecting capital into the economy, and acquiring a local pure player. That highlights that there's a risk. There's a risk with these things, and what we need to do is make sure that the government knows what it needs to do to be able to prevent the risk and the harm small business, and it also enable innovation, because you don't want to look at everything from a risk lens perspective, right? You want to be able to get progress and technology to be at the service of people and outcomes.
100%. And I often wonder as well. I remember when that happened, whether there are other, I guess, matters at play when it came to banning TikTok. Not the same reasons why they looked at it here in Australia, but when you've got that many people in a dispersed region, and you're trying to feed your people and keep keep everyone at rest and happy, there can often be other reasons at play there too. But that particular lens that the government needs to look through in managing small business is critical, especially in places like Indonesia, who rely on, they've got a lot of microeconomic matters to consider, and especially when it comes to, the way a lot of people make money over there too. But it's a
Yeah.
really interesting case, that, wasn't it?
Oh, I was surprised, and not surprised in a way. I mean, Indonesia, for me, when I look at it, has quite a few protectionist measures for the rest of the world. So investment in there is not as straightforward as it would be in other places, and they do want to protect their economy, but they also want to attract investment. But the fact that TikTok then decided to invest and circumnavigated the problem seemed a very tech-centric response to what regulation would be.
Yeah, yeah,
Bring capital, solve the problem. Let's move on.
yeah. That's it, mate. It's interesting as well, like, as you mentioned, Indonesia, they have a fairly big agri economy as well. But, in industries where, digital intensity meets environmental regulation, transformations driving resilience. Yeah, how do you see similar dynamics at play in Australia or across the areas where you've worked?
Yeah, so environmental regulation is a very important thing in Australia, and you mentioned Indonesia, and there's a uh, growing body of evidence that highlights that uh, when we're talking about nickel, for example, mining in Indonesia, the standards might not be the same. And in Australia, we obviously hold ourselves to extremely high environmental standards, um, and yet we have some holes in our legislation. And the holes in our legislation, in the EPBC Act, um, through the review that came, the Samuels review, effectively highlights that we definitely need an overhaul of that. I think the new environmental minister is looking to achieve that, but it needs to be achieved in a way that effectively facilitates decision making, because everything is a trade off. When we're looking at the current situation we're in the middle of an environmental crisis. The CPBC Act, we know it's not working very well. We're in the middle of a housing shortage, and in the middle of a energy transition, and all of that will likely require land, and will require permits, and the more thorough the analysis we do on the impacts facilitated by technology, and the quicker we do it, the quicker we can actually solve for these issues. So the housing crisis, environmental shortages, and the energy transition, and this is the technology will be able to help, but it requires a bit of a thinking game changer from the government to be able to say, well, we need to go faster in our processes, but we also need to preserve what's actually the backbone of everything, which is, natural capital. And doing that is basically providing clear guidelines as how trade-offs will work. And we've seen it through the energy transition. A lot of projects are waiting to be approved. And that means that capital that is waiting to be deployed cannot be deployed in the country, and it's something that will harm the country economically if we don't do that well.
Yeah, and it's something that your good friend and my cousin Tony O'Grady is passionate about, and getting natural capital onto a balance sheet, not just that of businesses, but of the government as well, because it's a finite resource. And you mentioned some critical inputs to building anything in this country, and energy is number one. If you don't have energy or water, you don't have industry. And I fear that we're on the way to energy poverty, if this, if we keep heading down this particular route. And it's very hard to get the balance right. It's easy enough to throw stones at the government. It's very hard to get that balance right. But without those key inputs, we die. But we use digital twins at Vaxa and AI and real time analytics, for our clients and within our business, and as do Big Four like PwC, and we see it as transformative, and as do our clients and those who use our solutions. But the uptake in supply chain planning across all of our clients in various industries in health, education, national security, food and agribusiness, it's growing. It's really growing. How might these tools, manifest in food, forestry, or natural capital supply chains in your mind?
Well, in the natural capital sense, the equation goes back a little bit further, and what was happening at the moment is people are grappling with their risk. So the scope one, what's my direct risk? Before I even get into my scope three and my supply chain, what is my direct risk from a natural capital perspective? And that's something Tony and I discussed so many times. We actually need to be able to get that part right, and then move very quickly into the supply chain, because if we think about it, food shortages create significant problems. We're lucky in Australia that we have, multiple bioclimatic regions. We're essentially a continent with, production of multiple food commodities, distributed. But when we look at the supply chain of, fertilizers and grains and so on and so forth, there's significant risk there that we need to be able to manage. And so the technologies that we're talking about, like digital twins, and real-time analytics, they should be able to give us an understanding of how things are performing. So environmental monitoring and so on and so forth, but not just how things are performing now, but how they're likely to perform in the future with the predictive analytics capabilities. And when we look at how supply chain risks are managed from a social perspective, there's another Australian startup that's doing really well, called Fair Supply, and they've mapped out pretty much a lot of the global supply chains, and are highlighting different risks. And usually, I think their strong suit is mainly focused on modern slavery and social concerns. Um, but effectively, that sort of same logic around mapping the critical supply chains, being able to understand, where different commodities come from, what goes into producing these types of commodities, and what are the different alternatives that we have, should there be another pandemic or something like that, is quite important, and technology will have that role to play, and is already playing that role in a lot of places.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And just seeing the uptake and I guess businesses and governments as well realizing that this is pretty serious stuff, and there are tools there that can help them with that planning because obviously that preparedness and planning, it negates the need for response and recovery, right? Like in any disaster, as we saw with COVID and things that other things that can be planned, but in when you look at the current world that we live in, and you're talking about the sovereign technology with these local startups that are building amazing products here in Australia, there's a growing recognition that full tech sovereignty it's unrealistic even for large governments and large powers and large businesses. So, what does sovereign digital infrastructure mean in practical terms? Particularly in Australia's context.
Sovereign digital capabilities is near impossible to achieve in the interconnected world that we're living in. It's just not
Mm,
possible. Although there are some counter examples of things that are starting to emerge, and soft iron
mm,
is highlighting some of those things, and probably from a risk perspective around backdoors and things like that. But the sovereign capability is, for me, when it comes to digital, is broken down into two parts. One, hardware, and the second one, software. And unfortunately, in the case of Australia, as many other players, we have a significant dependency on both of them. When we look at the software dependency, most of our computers are run on operating systems, um, uh, like Microsoft, or Apple if you've got a Mac, and then servers have their own operating systems, which include Linux. Also you have Linux as an operating system for computers, but they're not very much in use in the enterprise world. And so that dependency, um, creates a risk. Now, likely is the risk to manifest? We don't know, but we've seen some examples of risk, in this space manifesting in Europe, with the Amsterdam Trade Bank. There's a court case, in the Netherlands around Microsoft. And I can sort of give a bit of a background to that, but there's been some sanctions, as part of the Russian oligarchy, sanctions, with Alpha Bank, which owns a portion of the ATB, and Microsoft, being a cloud provider to the ATB, effectively was required to be able to suspend their services,
mm,
and then that created a risk, effectively, and the bank then spiraled down into insolvency, which is now into receivership. But then the thing is, Microsoft, which is governed by the clouds, there's a cloud act that came out in the US,
mm,
effectively, saying that if you need to suspend services, suspend, but you don't have to share any kind of data back. And so the government in the Netherlands is still waiting, I think, on the data to be able to do the administration process. And I think last time I checked, they still hadn't received it. But it just gives you an understanding of that. So on the software side, we don't make any kind of operating system. We don't have cloud. Our cloud sort of infrastructure is all dependent on the three majors in the US: Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. And might be a bit of Oracle here and there, but these are the big players, and they're mainly American. So we've got a dependency on them. Good thing is, American is a friend of Australia, and we shouldn't be worrying about that. So it's important to highlight, but we know we are in a sort of geopolitical sort of, I don't know what's the right word, sandstorm?
Yeah, at the moment.
It's a bit uncertain. But anyway, long-term ally, we shouldn't have an issue. The other aspect of that is the hardware dependency. We have a hardware dependency because we don't make our own hardware here for most part, and then soft iron is an exception to that.
Mm,
But our hardware for any kind of compute,
mm,
compute servers and computers, they're not made here. Okay, they're mainly made in Asia, in China, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. And but we depend on those. We depend on those countries to be able to provide the hardware. But if you look into the supply chain question of that, most, for example, solid state drives or hard disk drives require
mm.
magnets that require specific rare earths. And who's controlling most of the rare earth supply chain
Yeah, at the
at the
moment.
moment?
Yeah, China. It's a
Yeah.
tough one. Yeah, we've got some rare earths here in Australia, like RZ Resources are mining titanium, rutile, zircon, other bits and pieces. But and then they've got to be processed and then put into an actual product as well, right?
Yeah, so you've got your digging the mineral, then you've got your digging the mineral, you've got the refinery, and then you've got the actual manufacturing. And, well, China controls all of it,
Mm-hmm.
almost. I mean,
Yeah.
the numbers, could go
No,
80%, 70%,
I
whatever.
think it's close to 90, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so they control most of it, and the thing is, you know, again, in the geopolitical landscape that we're living in, we're seeing sort of, China and the US fighting a lot, and we trade a lot with China. They're our major trading partner. And so one of the risks that I see can manifest over time is we're caught in the middle.
Mm. Yeah, that's the thing. Like you said, we can dig it out of the ground, or we can create things. Like as an example, there's an organisation called Sweet Atoms, and they're creating carbons using bio waste, using agricultural offtake, glassy carbons and things like that, which at the moment China owns and creates the majority of carbons in the world. But it's all good and well to create this, but what do you do with it when we don't have sovereign manufacturing? You mentioned earlier as well the big one, chips. If as is expected, China forcibly take over Taiwan, or there's big issues for Australia. We'll know very quickly how much we rely on that particular type of hardware. That's it for this episode of the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast. If you found value here, subscribe, rate the show, and share it with someone building the future of critical industry. The path of leadership may be solitary, but the future of leadership is coactive intelligence. Be ready for today, be prepared for tomorrow.